The trucks were running, 3 of them, idling at a frozen crossroads east of Luneville, exhaust hanging in the cold like smoke from a chimney. Their beds were full. Crated machine gun parts, recovered radios, salvaged ordnance stacked tight under canvas. Late December, 1944, and beside the road in the snow sat 3 wounded men. Not loaded, not moving. A medic knelt over one of them with no blankets left. The trucks had room for guns. They did not have room for the men who fired them. This is what Patton did when his own officers chose equipment over wounded men. You have to understand how strange this looked from the road. Nobody was shooting. Nobody was shouting. It looked like nothing. 3 trucks waiting their turn. A medic working in the mud. A column backed up behind a bend nobody could see the end of. Drivers climbed down to stamp feeling back into their feet. Somebody folded a map and unfolded it again for no reason at all. Behind the 3 idling trucks, more vehicles had piled up past the bend, engines running just to keep from freezing solid, brakes locked against a slope nobody wanted to roll backward on. Every minute the column sat still was a minute the Germans further east did not have to spend retreating under pressure. Nobody said that out loud. Everyone there understood it anyway. It looked like the kind of delay that happens 50 times a day in a war. It was not that. Corporal Sam Aquila, 24, was the one kneeling in the snow. His fingers were already going white at the tips from changing dressings with no gloves on, because gloves made the work too clumsy to trust. One of the men in front of him was Private Daniel Ruzick, Danny, 22, out of Pittsburgh, a steel mill kid with a leg wound that had stopped bleeding clean an hour ago and had started, very quietly, to go the wrong color at the edges. Achille had flagged down the first truck himself, right at 6:30, when the column first stalled. The driver hadn't even cut the engine. He'd just pointed Achille toward a lieutenant standing by the cab with a clipboard. Lieutenant Walter Combs was 26, and he did not enjoy what he was about to say. He told Achille the trucks were designated cargo, not transport. He said it like he was reading it straight off the clipboard, because he basically was. Combs had a manifest, and the manifest said recovered ordnance, not wounded personnel. He told Achille there were ambulances coming. Achille asked when. Combs flipped a page like the answer might be written somewhere he hadn't looked yet. It wasn't. He did not have an answer for that. That should have been the end of it. A medic, a lieutenant, a clipboard. That is a logistics problem, not a story. The kind that gets resolved with a shrug and a wait. Except Achille had heard this exact explanation 2 days earlier, almost word for word, and he knew exactly where it had come from. 3 days before, a recovery convoy near Moncourt had been hauling out salvaged equipment. 3 crated machine guns, a radio set, when a truck got rerouted at the last minute to carry 2 wounded men instead. The equipment sat alone on the roadside overnight, unguarded, because nobody had thought to leave a man with it, and by the time anyone remembered, the convoy was already 2 miles up the road. By morning, it was gone. Looted, lost. Nobody ever proved which. What came back instead was a written reprimand, and it landed on the desk of Captain Earl Voss, the battalion transport officer. Negligent loss of material. Voss kept that paper folded in his coat pocket, against his chest, the way some men carried a photograph. He had reread it more times than he would have admitted to anyone. The way a man rereads something he is trying to convince himself was fair. So when Achille went over Combs's head and found Voss standing by the lead truck near noon, Voss already had his answer ready. He didn't even raise his voice. He said it was procedure, not cruelty. He said the wounded would be picked up by dedicated transport, the way they were supposed to be. He took the paper out of his pocket while he said it, like it was a permission slip he needed to keep showing himself before he could believe it. You start to see it now. Voss isn't some cartoon villain who hates wounded men. He's a man who got burned once for making the human choice. and he has decided never to get burned that way again. That's worse, in a way. A cruel man is just cruel, and you can see him coming. A frightened man builds a policy out of his fear and calls it discipline, and then it isn't only his problem anymore. It's Danny's. The ambulances Voss was so sure about were 2 villages back, stuck behind the exact same convoy backup everyone else was stuck behind. Nobody was coming, not soon, maybe not for hours. The cold did not care about paperwork. By 1300, Danny's calf had gone from pink to a dull gray at the edges, and gray does not turn back into pink on its own. Achille kept changing the dressing because it was the only thing he still had the authority to do. He tried one more level up. A regimental adjutant heard the complaint secondhand, relayed over a field phone that rang twice before anyone bothered answering, and told him to let it go through channels. Channels meant hours. Channels meant nobody had to be the one who said the policy was wrong, because nobody had to stand in the snow and look at Danny while they said it. That's the real shape of the failure, if you look at it straight on. Combs failed because he never had the authority to override the manifest in the first place. He was a motor officer, not a transport commander, and the line on his clipboard was not his to cross out. Voss failed because he had the authority and used it to protect his own file instead of the man bleeding in front of him. The adjutant failed in a third way entirely. He had both the rank and the time to act, and he chose neither because acting meant putting his name on a decision somebody else had already gotten in trouble for making. 3 different ranks, 3 different excuses, and the same 3 wounded men, still sitting against the same stone wall in the same snow. It might have stayed buried in channels, except for one thing. Among the wounded near that wall was an officer, banged up but conscious enough to understand exactly what he was looking at. He got a message out. Not a complaint, not a request for sympathy. A phrase. Wounded men left behind for cargo space. That kind of phrase does not sit quietly on a field phone line. It moves. It moves the way a spark moves through dry grass, fast and without asking permission. It reached Corps headquarters faster than anyone at that crossroads expected, and it reached Patton almost as fast behind it. According to later accounts, he didn't wait for the full written report. He didn't ask for names or numbers first. He told them to get his Jeep. Everyone who was there that day expected the same thing once word came down that he was coming. They expected him to arrive already furious, find Voss, and take the man apart in front of the whole stalled convoy. That was the Patton they knew by reputation. Fast, loud, merciless to any officer who embarrassed him in front of the line. They had heard the stories about other roads, other delays, other officers who hadn't moved fast enough, and paid for it in front of their own men. So when the field phone rang for the second time that hour, and somebody said he was already in the Jeep, officers up and down the column started straightening their coats out of pure instinct. The way men do before an inspection. They know they're going to fail. The Jeep came up the road within the hour, faster than anyone had planned for. Combs stopped talking mid-sentence. Voss's reprimand, still folded in his pocket, suddenly felt like nothing at all in his hand. Patton didn't look at the trucks first. He didn't look at Voss first either. He walked straight past both of them into the snow, where Achille was still kneeling beside Danny, with the same dressing he'd already changed 3 times. How long has he been sitting there? He wasn't asking Voss. He was asking Achille. That's the temperature change. That's the exact moment the whole crossroads understood the story had stopped being about a manifest and a clipboard. Patton crouched down in the snow, without seeming to notice the cold, looked at the leg, looked hard at the color of it, and stood back up, already moving toward the trucks. "What's in that truck?" Voss answered fast, the clipboard still in his hand like it could explain anything at all. "Recovered ordnance, sir. Per the directive after." "Get it out." "Sir, there's a directive after Moncourt. We lost." "I don't care what you lost." Patton didn't raise his voice. That was almost worse than if he had. Tell me what you almost lost twice. Voss didn't have an answer for that one. There wasn't a line on the manifest that covered it. Danny tried to push himself up against the wall, embarrassed by all the attention landing near him. "I can walk if somebody just helps me up," he said. Quiet. The kind of thing a 22-year-old says when he doesn't want to be the reason 3 officers are standing in the road arguing. Patton turned to Combs. "Help him up." You'd think that's where the anger comes out. It doesn't. Patton doesn't tear the reprimand out of Voss's pocket and rip it apart in front of the men. He doesn't relieve him on the spot, doesn't send him back in disgrace for the whole battalion to hear about by nightfall. That's the part that surprises people when they hear the story told. Not because it's soft, but because it ends up being sharper than the punishment would have been. He has Voss unload the crates himself, by hand, in front of the men he'd been protecting them from. He has him stand there while soldiers pull the salvaged equipment out of the truck bed and stack it on the roadside under a 2-man guard. Then he puts Voss in charge of personally getting the wounded to the aid station, not delegating it to Combs, not assigning it to a sergeant, driving it himself. Think about why that lands harder than a court-martial would have. A punishment removes a man from the problem and lets him stew somewhere else. This does not remove him. It puts the exact thing he was protecting directly under his own hands, in the snow, in front of the same men who watched him refuse them an hour earlier, and makes him choose again, with everyone watching. Voss had spent 3 days building a policy specifically, so he would never again have to make that choice in public. Now he's driving the truck himself, and there is no clipboard line anywhere that covers what that feels like. The equipment didn't get abandoned, and that's worth saying plainly, because this isn't really a story about throwing guns into a snowbank to make a point. It got marked, it got guarded, and it got left behind for a second run later that afternoon, sitting in neat rows where the crates had come off the truck beds. The trucks got reloaded with wounded men instead, and somebody pulled the blankets off the cab seats because there weren't enough left anywhere else along that stretch of road. A sergeant nobody had given an order to start directing the heavier vehicles around a frozen rut at the edge of the crossroads on his own, just so the loaded trucks wouldn't have to slow down twice. Achille climbed into the truck bed to keep working on Danny along the way, frostbitten fingers and all. Combs carried him to the truck himself, the same lieutenant who, an hour earlier, had a perfectly good clipboard reason for why he couldn't. Before they lifted him in, Danny's bootlace had frozen stiff, twisted under the wrap of a fresh bandage. He pulled a pocket knife out of his coat. His father's carried the whole war, the kind of object a man keeps without ever explaining why, and cut the lace clean, rather than waste another minute working it loose with fingers that had stopped answering him properly. It was a small thing. Nobody made a speech about it. It just happened, quietly, the way small things happen in the middle of something much larger. And somebody remembered it later, precisely because nothing else about that hour stood out as cleanly. Voss drove the lead truck out himself. Nobody ordered him to look proud about it, and by most later tellings, he didn't look anything at all. He just drove, both hands on the wheel, eyes on the road he'd spent 3 days insisting was someone else's problem. What stayed with the men who told this story afterward wasn't the anger everyone had braced for walking in. It was the order of operations. Patton asked about the man before he asked about the equipment, and that detail outlasted everything else from that afternoon. The man with the reprimand folded in his coat pocket ended up being the one who got the wounded out personally, and somehow that detail survived in the retelling longer than the paperwork that had started the whole mess in the first place. By the time the last truck pulled off down the road toward the aid station, the crossroads that had been jammed since 6:30 with idling engines and stranded men was just a road again. Crates sitting in the snow under a 2-man guard. Tire tracks pressed deep and heading the right direction for once. No more arguing. No more clipboards changing hands at the tailgate. Just an empty stretch of frozen road where, an hour before, nobody on either side of the argument could move. Whether Voss deserved that kind of correction instead of a harder one is still something men argued about long after the war ended. Some thought Patton let him off easy, putting him to work instead of breaking him in front of the column the way reputation said he should have. Others thought there was no harder punishment available than making a frightened man carry, with his own hands, the exact weight he had spent 3 days trying to avoid. There were men who said afterward that they'd rather have taken the court-martial than the truck, if it had been them standing where Voss stood. Either way, the equipment came back later, on that second run, sitting exactly where it had been left, untouched. The men did not wait for a second run of their own. Was that the right call, or just the lucky one? Should he have gotten there faster, before a man's leg had time to start turning the wrong color? Was it discipline? Or was it simply that somebody finally asked the question nobody else along that road had been willing to ask out loud? Would another commander with the same reputation and the same hour to spare have done it any differently?